in 1826. Again, another island system that didn't have this problem. And of course, it caused problems for human beings, but for the birds. Hawaii has more extinct birds than anywhere else in the world. Just since the 1980s, 10 unique birds have disappeared. Extinction. Virtually every individual of endemic species below 4,000 feet in elevation has been eliminated by the disease. That's avian malaria. The mosquitoes are limited to lower elevations below 5,000 feet by cold temperatures that prevent larval development. So the lucky birds, the lucky species are those above 5,000 feet. The rest are condemned to either adapt to avian malaria, just like we're forcing to cope with chikungunya and dengue and God knows what else we come via this species. This is the reality today. The slide clearly demonstrates maritime connectivity and just how dense it is for the Caribbean. We are subject to global trade and therefore should be aware of and prepared for the impacts from an ecological, social, and an economic perspective. Invasive alien species and pathogens are priorities that the shipping sector should be prepared for. This is what regional maritime trade in the Caribbean looks like today. And these two images reflect the threat from invasive alien species to the region. I would quote Tuck Hines, director of the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center here, when he says, "It affects everything, from what's growing on the bottom of your sailboat, to what's fouling your power plant cooling intake systems, to the diseases that are preventing fisheries from being maintained, to red tides, to fish gobbling up other fish. It's an almost endless array of ecological and economic impacts at almost every level." The overall trend is for an increase in the sector, as clearly seen from this graph and from the presentations this morning. We expect to see continuation and development in the sector. However, the World Shipping Council notes that invasive alien species is a risk that the industry must face and set up systems to cope with. They noted on this website that when it comes to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, they take some serious measures. The Asian gypsy moth is a highly destructive environmental pest, and it can be transported via ships and international shipping containers. And so the U.S. Customs and Border Protection inspect vessels upon arrival in the U.S. to ensure that they are not infested with the egg masses of this moth. Vessels found to have more than several egg masses on board will either be detained in port until the egg masses are removed, or will be ordered to return to sea to remove the egg masses prior to being allowed entry into the US or Canada. And when it looks at the wood packaging materials, they also note that according to the ISPM 15 standard, which is the guidelines for regulating wood packaging material in international trade, it says that such wood packaging material should be either heat-treated or fumigated and then marked with the IPC logo and the country code in which the treatment occurred. So the Shipping Council is noting that these are expectations from the US government, at least in terms of addressing these issues in the case of this moth. But we've also had issues of the giant African land snail arriving here. And in 1966, according to the US Fish and Wildlife, a boy from, in 1966 in Miami, Florida, a boy smuggled 3 giant African snails into South Florida upon returning from a trip to Hawaii. His grandmother eventually released the snails into the garden. 7 years later, more than 18,000 adult snails were found, along with thousands of eggs. It took 10 years, and cost $1 million to eradicate the pest in Florida. This is under the Pest Alert Plant Protection Quarantine, April 2011. Now, that point goes to the holidaymakers and your cruise ship passengers. They need to be aware that when they step off into these territories, you may like things, but to bring them on board, you could have issues. What you're looking at here, pink hibiscus mealybug to the top left, and the red palm mite. Similarly, these two pest insects have spread through the Caribbean, having destructive impact on agriculture and horticultural industries. In terms of economic losses, concise data on the economic loss caused by pink hibiscus mealybug in Grenada was between 1995 and 1998 totaled US dollars $18.3 million. Trinidad and Tobago, where potential losses to agriculture and forestry were predicted to cost 125 million US. However, they were able to successfully control this spread, and it was reduced to $5.1 million between 1994 and 1997. The red palm mite, the lower one, is linked to more than 50% loss of production of coconuts, which has resulted in more significant increases in coconut prices for affected islands. It is thought that the spread of the mite was hastened by passengers carrying the crafted hats and these coconut leaf products that aren't treated in any way, and they move them, but they've got all these little mites on it. You see the tourists and everybody got them on their head, but all that stuff is crawling around. They don't, you're not aware, So there is a reality that you have to think about with these things. Here's a list of other insects that have become prominent in the region. And the Africanized honeybee, that was an experiment gone awry, where somebody thought it was a good idea to introduce this bee into Brazil for honey quality. And we've had fatalities in Trinidad from Africanized bees, and in other places as well. In terms of the movement of plants, this has become somewhat of a common practice in the region, where entire trees with a ball of soil are shipped for landscaping purposes. These carry an inherent risk of transferring invasive alien species by shipment. This presents an opportunity for the vessels to act like super vectors, as the term was used before. Such as the red palm mite, pink mealybug, even African giant snails could be transported as juvenile or as egg masses. It is important to note that the USA does not allow plants and lumber on open racks or in open top containers to enter the US this way. Shipments of plants, perishable fruits, and vegetables must be fumigated for all possible insects and shipped in closed containers. They are then closely inspected by the US Department of Agriculture personnel for potential pests. I spoke about the standards for the wood packaging material earlier. Conversely, however, the USA does not impose such strict regulatory measures on exporters. For most importers in the Caribbean, all that is required is a phytosanitary certificate to cover soil quality, but no treatment of foliage is required. This also applies to shipment of lumber, fruits, and vegetables. It is therefore important that local customs authorities pay close attention to the importation of these items and the commodities. I was telling someone about an incident where we had a shipment of lumber coming to Port Castries, and it was infested with lumber weevil. The shipment was unloaded, and the lumber weevil escaped into adjacent neighborhood. And right away, the Ministry of Agriculture got inundated with calls about these insects in their homes, and so the lumber had to be restacked on board and shipped off. I think it went to Dominican Republic for fumigation and treatment, and thereafter I'm not sure what happened, but it was returned to St. Lucia. I'm not. But that's the kind of thing that our own ports need to be aware of and proactive about. Placing tarps and netting on products shipped openly can help to mitigate the transportation of insects and other potential invasive species. It is important that the importers should insist that the shippers in the US fumigate plants prior to covering them with tarps and netting. When I'm looking at invasives, it's not only the insects, the invertebrate stuff, but we also have issues with mammals. Many of us from the Caribbean know about the